I think I would like people to walk away with the understanding that Adam was supposed to be a part of the family. He was created to be a son of God. He was a son in the Father's house with all the rights and privileges of his estate. And because of sin, fellowship was broken. That is the reconciliation. See, Christ redeems us first because he redeems us from the condemnation with the dragon, which I talk about in the book. He redeems us with his blood, but it doesn't stop there. See, because the redemption happens in order that we might be reconciled to the Father and to the family. Because right now we're enemies of God because of sin and because of and we're condemned because of sin and we're enemies of God. But through the cross, through the redemption, we're purchased back for God so that we can be reconciled back to him, brought back into the family. It's Christ who leads us home, by the way. Jesus, he evokes the prodigal son on the eve of his crucifixion. Most people miss this when he tells his disciples that he's going to be leaving for a while. And they're not going to be able to follow him. And they say, where are you going? And why can't we follow him? He said that he's going to his Father's house. And where he's going, you can't yet follow. And he said, in my Father's house are many rooms. And I am going there to prepare a place for you. And if I'm going to prepare a place for you, I will come back to get you so that you might be with me where I am. What is that? That's the prodigal son. So now we know how the prodigal son gets home. Jesus brings the prodigals home to the Father's house. Jesus brings us home to the Father's house. He's going to prepare our place, the place of Adam in the Father's house, and then he's coming to get us, to bring us back into the family, to reconcile us to the Father. And so you have the redemption at the cross, you have the reconciliation in Christ, and then you have to the family at the resurrection, and you have the restoration of all that was lost. Jesus is the hero of humanity. And he's the original hero, and he's the greatest hero humanity has ever known.
Oh, there's a chilling in the air, people dying in despair. There's a shadow falling down upon the land. Now the devil's on the loose. He knows the time it's coming soon for the final battle with the Son of Man. Now don't you want to join the winning side? My friend, it's time to come to Christ. Time to wake up now. This is your final hour. The night's soon coming when man can't work. The Lord's coming back to judge this earth. Before your clock unwinds, it's time to come to Christ. To the temple the beast will come and claim he's the chosen one. Give him praise or die is his command. Now it's time for you to choose, for Armageddon's coming soon. Accept his mark or die for the Son of Man. Now don't you get caught up in Satan's lies, 'cause Christ will come as a thief in the night. Time to wake up now. This is your final hour. The new world order, it just won't work. The Lord's coming back to judge this earth. Before your clock unwinds, it's time to come to Christ. At his command, the bridles will be gliding high on the blood of the lost. For on wanna stand at his right side. You see, my friend, it's all been prophesied. Time to wake up now. This is the final hour before the Father's clock unwinds. Don't let your time pass you by. My friend, it's always time. Time to come to Christ. Before the false prophet lies. It's time to come to Christ. Don't get caught by surprise. It's time to come to Christ. For your soul you decide. You gotta come to Christ. Why don't you come to Christ?
I certainly haven't been idle. For the last couple of years, I've been working on two main projects. One, of course, was my book. I did a lot of research and some intensive writing for that book, and that's obviously finally finished. And also, I've been filming a television series. That's been a lot of work, and I was overseas for 6 months. I was on several expeditions and doing all kinds of exciting things. A lot of what we did was in Peru. This is all different from the True Legends stuff. This is a whole different project. Really, it's a television show for network television or streaming platform. I do have a lot of details about it, but I'm not at liberty yet to announce the details of that show. But I can tell you that I'm working with Gary Haven. Gary and I have partnered up, and we've made some incredible discoveries. Stay tuned for that sometime in the future. There's a long story related to this project. I'll tell you in brief. It began as a treasure hunt, actually. It was a big group of us in Peru, and we had a crew of 20 people, more than 20 people, actually. Jamie Walden was in Peru with me and some other people that the audience might know. And we were originally shooting for a treasure hunting show, and we ended up pivoting because we ran into some precarious situations with the Peruvian mob. And we had to switch directions and film a different kind of show that we had not anticipated. And I literally had to rewrite this whole show and switch gears. And so we ended up doing something else. I'll tell you one thing. We went up and we made a fascinating discovery of what we think is one of the legendary lost cities of the Inca. That's about as much as a tease as I can give you. And it was going to be on network TV actually last month. It was going to air prime time. And that fell through under some very strange circumstances. So Gary and I have decided to take matters into our own hands, and we're now producing. We're just going forward with the production of the show ourselves. That's what I've been working on. I'm doing a lot of editing. I've directed it. I'm editing it, hosted it. And so that's in the works. And I can't tell you where that's going to land yet, but I can tell you that it's exciting. It's going to be very compelling and a very powerful show. No, Steve and I decided to part ways about 2 years ago because we're both kind of just really engaged in our own projects now. Steve's got all kinds of cool stuff going on, and I've got cool stuff going on. So we just decided that it would probably be better for us to focus on our own projects. That was about 2 years ago. I know Steve's continuing with the True Legends conferences and all of that, and I encourage everybody to follow him, continue to support him and follow him. He's got great stuff. I write this in the beginning of my book in a note from the author. This book actually began on the bank, a tributary to the River Masan, which is a tributary to the Napo, which is itself a tributary to the Amazon. And I can remember I was 18 or 19. I don't remember if I was 18. I think I was 18. Can't really remember if I was 18 or 19. I was somewhere in that age range, pacing on the side of this smaller river. Sada was the name of it, the River Sada. One morning I woke up and I began to contemplate the Garden of Eden. I began to contemplate Adam and Eve. Not a hard thing to do when you're in the middle of the Amazon. I really began to understand the gospel in a different way and understand what it means to be a human being, what it means to be Adam, essentially. And that's where this book began. That's literally where this began for me. And so that question, what does it mean to be a human being, has been percolating in my mind for years. And this book is the culmination of these different tracks of thought that I've been having at different stages in my life, and they've all converged in this book. And I think that will become apparent to people if they read it. In the course of writing this book, I realized that in order to tell this story that I was unfolding to get to the end game, and revolving around the notion of the birthright, the last chapter of the book is called Jacob and Esau. And that was the end game for me. That was where I knew I wanted to get. I didn't realize that to get there, I was going to end up going all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to the creation of mankind, and indeed even further back into the remote past, the unknowable past, the pre-Adamic past. And it's when I went back to the beginning and I started working my way forward that those contemplations that I had in the jungle started surging back into my mind. I had not planned on writing the things that I began to contemplate, back when I was 18 years old in the Amazon, and it suddenly just started coming out of me. And so that was surprising to me. And I spent the first 4 or 5 chapters, probably 4 chapters, writing about the beginning of mankind, and the what happened in the Garden of Eden, what Eden may represent. I would say I have a very unique take on what Eden represents. So all of this stuff just started coming out of me. So the book, to answer your question, the book, it ended up being a lot broader in scope than I had originally intended. I guess the best way to answer that question is to define what I mean by birthright and what I mean by dominion of the earth. Because as I define in my book, the birthright of Adam, the birthright of the human species is dominion of planet Earth. That is our birthright. And I believe that I prove that with the text of Scripture, that is in fact why Adam was created. See, Adam wasn't created and then given a purpose. Adam was created for a purpose. And those are very distinct concepts, because the one is kind of whimsical when creating this new being, this new creature in the cosmos of creation, mankind, creating him and then figuring out what am I going to do with him, right? As opposed to there's a purpose here, and I'm going to create mankind to fill this purpose. There's a task here, there's a role, and we need to create a new kind of creature to fulfill that role. And I believe that is the depiction of the creation of Adam, the biblical perspective of how Adam was created. He was created for a purpose, not created and then given a purpose. And that's very, very important. And his purpose, in a nutshell, well, I would say there's 2 primary aspects to our purpose. When I say Adam is us. And Adam has 2 primary purposes, had 2 primary purposes. The first he lost, and the second remains. And it's going to remain, I think, until the very end, when he's going to lose it, when we're going to lose it. The first is to be a part of the family of God. Adam was created as a sibling in the family. And that's why Adam is called a son of God. In the genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth, it goes all the way through Jesus' genealogy. In one version, Jesus the son of Joseph, or Jesus the son of Mary, and then the son of so-and-so, and the son of so-and-so, all the way back through to the antediluvian world and the antediluvian patriarchs, working its way all the way through the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. And so we have this lineage as the offspring of Adam that traces all the way back to our original progenitor, Adam, who was a son of God. And so Adam was created to be a part of the family. In fact, the language of Scripture is familial. It's familial. The vernacular of our relationship with the Father is framed in those familial terms, and the way that we relate to our Father who is in heaven, the way that we relate to each other who are in the faith, the brethren. And so we know that because of the testimony of Scripture, we know that mankind was created to be with the Father, in the Father's house. And this is, of course, the parable of the prodigal son, which we can get into later. That's the primary purpose. Adam was created to be a son in the Father's house. Not the only son, by the way, but a son, the younger sibling. The second purpose was because Adam was a son of God, he was part of the you might consider it the royal house. And Adam was tasked, mandated with the dominion of the earth, the governance of planet Earth. And so Adam was given the title deed of planet Earth and was supposed to govern the earth. Indeed, today is still supposed to govern the earth. So the birthright of Adam is dominion of the earth. And so those are the two primary reasons that Adam was created. He was created first for fellowship in the family of God, and second, for governance of the earth. And those two themes are laced all the way through the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. And I follow that thread all the way in my book from the first chapter to the last chapter. And so it becomes very apparent, when you read the scriptures, how Jesus says that we're going to become like the angels in response to a question. The woman lost her husband, several men before she died, and whose wife would she be in heaven, basically? And Jesus' answer was that in heaven, no one is married or given in marriage. And he said, but you will be like the angels in respect to their immortal condition, but not just in respect to their immortal condition, also in respect to their estate. Jesus says that we were given power to become sons of God, that we would become like the angels, being sons of the resurrection, he says. So the power to become a son of God, and we can loop back to this later on if we decide to talk about something further down the line here that I think is really crucial. We're given the power to become the sons of God through the resurrection. The resurrection is the power. So when Jesus says that we've been given power to become the sons of God, it is the resurrection that effectuates the new birth in Christ and that restores us to the family. An extraterrestrial is basically it's a sentient entity, if you're talking about conscious beings whose provenance, whose origin is not planet Earth. So if you have an entity in the cosmos of creation, if you have an entity whose origin is not the Earth, then that entity is by definition extraterrestrial. Extra meaning not of the Earth, and then terrestrial, the Earth. So they're not from the Earth. They're extraterrestrial. They're from somewhere else. So their origin is not planet Earth. And then the definition for alien, again, I don't remember exactly how I put it in the book, but it would be something along the lines of something approximating an entity that is not human, that is not us. So any entity that is not human, that is not the offspring of Adam and Eve, is by definition alien to the human race. And of course, we're talking about conscious beings. In the context of my book, we're talking about conscious, sentient beings. So based on those two definitions, extraterrestrial and alien, then I posit the question, does the Bible introduce us? Does it introduce any such beings that might be defined as extraterrestrial and alien? And the answer is, of course, unequivocally yes, resoundingly yes. We have this class of beings who are called angels. And by the way, angel is a very somewhat nebulous designation because it doesn't give us any information about the nature of the beings that it designates, because the word angel, malak in the Hebrew and angelos in the Greek, it just means messenger, an envoy, one who is sent. And in fact, that very same word, angel, that we translate as angel, is used in several other places in the Old Testament to describe human beings who are operating in the function of messengers or envoys. So it doesn't necessarily, it's not exclusive to heavenly beings, the term angel. Although when it's used in scriptures, most of the time it is referring to heavenly beings. Right off the bat in chapter 1, in fact, the first chapter of my book, and this caused a lot of controversy, I noticed. Last time you and I talked, there was some real acrimony, some real controversy, because I used the term elder race to describe the angels. Well, if anybody wants to read my book, they better get used to it, because I use that term from start to finish. In fact, the very first chapter of my book is entitled The Elder Race. And I've invented that term because, again, the word angel is nebulous, and so I kind of created my own term, and it makes sense because the word elder means older, It's just another way to say older. And race, I think, is self-explanatory. So if we have an angelic race of entities that are not us, they're not human, and they're older than us, you and I can agree that both of those things are obviously true according to the scriptures. They're not human and they're older than us. That makes them an elder race, right? It makes them an elder race. So I'm not saying anything controversial here just because people haven't heard this term in their ears yet. It's nothing controversial. It's just me describing the reality of these beings in a way that is useful to me as I move forward in the book, so that I don't always have to go back and, or use nebulous terms like angel. I can actually say elder race as opposed to, and in contrast to, human race. We are human. They are not. We're the younger ones. They're the older ones. And again, to clarify, they are not human. They're not us. And that makes them, by the way, and they're not from the earth. We know that. They shouted for joy when the earth was created, according to the book of Job. Therefore, they are extraterrestrial and alien. Whether people like it or not. I mean, that's by definition, that's what these entities are. And I'm not saying that they're gray aliens with the big black eyes or anything like that. That's a totally different situation. In fact, I think that we look very much like them. So these are not grotesque beings. In fact, these are sons of God. They're part of the family. Some people might recognize a little hat tip to J.R.R. Tolkien here, because in the I always pronounce this wrong. The Silmarillion, is it the Silmarillion? Well, I read it and I can't remember I never pronounce it properly. He designates the elves as the Eldar. And Tolkien obviously was he obviously was viewing the Bible from this perspective, that there's the human beings who are the younger race, and then there's the Eldar. So I'm just curious if anybody picked up on that. If not, that's the little hat tip to J.R.R. Tolkien there. So the parable of the prodigal son, I think, is one of the most imperative parables to understand. And of course, it's a parable of Christ, and Jesus relates this parable of the prodigal son. I think everybody's familiar with it. So I'll just give people a Cliff Note version. There's a father who has this household. You might envision it as a royal household because the father is apparently pretty wealthy, and he has at least two sons in this household. There's an older son and a younger son. These sons have a co-inheritance in their father's house. They have a co-inheritance in their father's house. They're both sons, right? So as the sons of the father, they both have an inheritance of his estate, right? So they start off in their father's estate, and they have an inheritance in their father's estate. And the younger son decides that he wants his father to give him his inheritance now, whatever that would be, sheep or cows, whatever that would have been in the context of that parable, so that he can go and basically live it up in the world. And so his father grants him his request. He gives him his inheritance. And the prodigal son, goes out and he squanders his inheritance. In other words, he sells the goods that were in his inheritance, and he goes and he squanders the money on debauchery, and he ends up in squalor, in such a degree of squalor that he actually becomes indentured to a swineherd. And the swineherd is an archetype of Satan. And he ends up eating the slop of pigs because he's so poor. So he's keeping pigs for the swineherd, feeding the pigs, and eating the slop of pigs because he's so poor. He's so destitute. And he realizes in his depravity, he realizes that even the servants in his father's house are living much better than him. The servants at least have food and a roof over their heads and are living in a much more luxurious lifestyle than he is, eating a slop of pigs. And so he decides that he's going to return to his father's house and beg his father to take him back, if only as a lowly servant. Not a son anymore. He's forfeited that. Just take me back as a servant. And so he determines to do this. And he's under the impression, I think we can infer from the parable, that his father is going to be exceedingly angry with him for squandering his inheritance. And so the prodigal son makes his way back to the father's house, expecting his father to be angry. But he is shocked to find that instead of his father being angry, his father is waiting for him at the door. And when he sees him coming from afar off, he runs out to meet him, and he embraces him, and he kisses his neck, which is, of course, an unexpected reception. Rather than taking him back, begrudgingly taking him back as a servant in his house, he receives him again as his son, brings him back into the house, clothes him with a clean robe, clean garments, and new sandals on his feet, which is representative of the resurrection and the righteousness of Christ. Puts a ring on his finger. That's the seal of his house, the Father's house. In other words, the Son is brought back into the family. Ring goes on the finger. He's a full member of the family again. New garments. People are beginning to pick up the gospel here in this story big time. There's a fatted calf that's slain, and so that they can have a feast and a party. The father instructs the servants to throw this banquet. And then you have some commentary from the older brother, who's a little bit ticked off because his commentary to the father was, you never slaughtered a fatted calf for me. You never threw me a big party, and I never left. I was always here with you in the house. He goes off and spends his inheritance, squanders his inheritance, and comes back, and you're throwing him this big party. I've always been here with you. And so there's basically four characters. There's actually five. You have the father, his two sons, the older brother and the younger brother. You have the swineherd, again, an archetype of Satan. And you have the servants. And I make this case in my book that this is an amazing depiction of the gospel. And I think it goes over a lot of people's heads. This is I think this is probably the clearest depiction of the gospel in the scriptures. This parable actually depicts the gospel better than I think any of the apostles could explain it in the epistles, in the New Testament. Jesus' parable. So obviously, we know who the Father is. The Father is the Father, the very same Father who Jesus would pray to. Our Father who art in heaven, that's the Father. We know that one of the sons, now, before I get into this, let me say that there is a superficial interpretation, because the prophecy and parables and things, oftentimes they're layered. There's layered interpretations. It's not always just one. Sometimes there's multiple. In fact, I think in many cases, and I demonstrate that in my book, there's multiple interpretations, and they're all correct simultaneously. For example, the parable of the prodigal son is certainly applicable to Israel and Judah, right? And so in the context of Israel and Judah, of course, Judah split off, Israel splintered off and so forth, and was regathered. And so there is an interpretation there, but I believe the deeper interpretation as it pertains to the gospel of Christ, we are the younger brother, Adam. Adam is the younger brother. Adam is the one who squanders his inheritance. And the older brother are the other sons of God who are with the Father, the very sons of God that the Bible designates the sons of God. So I'm not making up terminology here. You have Adam, a son of God, right? Picture Adam from the beginning before the fall. Because before people start wondering about this, Adam lost his estate at the fall. He did not lose his birthright, but he lost his estate. Okay? So at the fall, Adam loses his estate. He is sundered from the family of God, which was the most drastic and terrible consequence of the fall. Being sundered from the family of God. That's our number one problem as the human species. We've been sundered from the Father. And of course, I think we all know that, those of us who are believers. Adam's the younger brother. The other sons of God are the older brother. The servants. I remember I was writing about this in my book because I hadn't contemplated the servants either until I was copying the parable from the Bible into my book, and I just sort of froze. And I thought, okay, I know who the sons are. That's evident. Adam was a son of God, and then there's these other sons of God. We know who the father is. The swineherd is apparently, I think very clearly, an archetype of Satan. So who are the servants? Obviously, there's a whole cosmology here that we don't understand. The universe is comprised of more than God, angels, and humans, and demons. Those are basically the four categories that most Christians contemplate. There's God, there's angels, there's demons, and there's humans. And I'm here to tell you that is woefully underestimating the grandeur, the immensity, the complexity of God's creation. I think there's a myriad, and we've talked about this, I think, probably half a dozen times. There's a myriad of things out there that we have no idea about, obviously. The servants, I think, represent sentient entities that they're not the devil, and they're not enemies of God. They're in the kingdom of heaven, but they're not the sons of God. They're not part of the family. So I had to contemplate this idea that are there sentient entities in the cosmos who are not part of the family? but nevertheless are sentient, conscious beings. And so then you have to ask, well, who is part of the family? The Bible tells us the sons of God. Why else would we find these familial terms in the Bible? Unless we were intended to understand them the way that we understand our families. See, how do you understand the Father? How can we understand the hierarchy of the kingdom? Well, we can understand it because every single one of us is part of a family. Every one of us. Most of us have siblings. All of us have a mother and a father. Not all of us know our mother and father, but all of us have a mother and father. We're either sons or daughters. And then most of us end up becoming mothers and fathers ourselves. We know what a family is. We understand the language of the family. And the language of the family is not derived principally from us, from human beings. It preexists us. We were brought into the family, and then we were allowed in a remarkable show of affection and favor by the Maker, by the Father. We were privileged with the ability to then procreate our own families as an image, as a likeness, as a shadow of something else, of the family of God. And we all know that there's a family of God. What Christian would deny that there's a family of God? No Christian would deny that there's a family. Not any Christian that reads the Bible, that's for sure. And so we have to contemplate our story within the context of a family. I like to think of it as a royal family, a royal household. And so who are the servants? I guess I just took a very long time to say I don't know. At the beginning of that chapter, I start off with Plato's allegory of the cave, which is a perfect allegory. It's perfectly applicable to what we're talking about because, and we've talked about this before, but it's useful for people to reimagine this scenario. And again, I'm going to nutshell this. So this is a very abridged version of Plato's allegory of the cave. It's in my book. And in his allegory, there's these individuals who from the time they're in this peculiar situation, these individuals in this little universe that Plato creates in his mind, these individuals have a very bizarre condition. They've been living in a cave since they were infants. In fact, they're not living in a cave, they're chained up in this cave. And so their entire life, all they've been able to see is one facet of the cave, the wall that's in front of them. They have no idea what's outside the cave because the mouth of the cave is behind them. And so all they see is the wall of the cave in front of them. Their comprehension of the exterior world, in fact, of reality itself, is derived solely from what they see, the shadows that they see on the wall, because Plato sets up a scenario in which behind them, there's a fire, and behind that fire, behind them, there's activity happening, and then there's a fire. And so that fire is casting the shadows on the wall. Everything that's happening outside of the cave, they view it in shadow on the wall, in silhouette. So they view the world, they're constrained, they have this peculiar condition that they are condemned to see the world in shadows. So this is a really good allegory for the offspring of Adam and the fall. Because of sin, we also are condemned, because of the fall, we also are condemned to see the world in shadows. And so we have a problem which Paul defines. Paul talks about us seeing as if through a glass dimly, or we're looking into a dim mirror, something to that effect. The King James, I think, has it, we see as through a glass dimly. And that is, and of course, back in the ancient times, even if Paul's talking about a mirror, he's not talking about the kind of mirror that we're used to. They didn't have mirrors, glass mirrors. They had obsidian mirrors. And so when you looked into it's a black obsidian stone. And so when you look at a black obsidian stone, if you were holding up a mirror, an obsidian stone mirror, or polished bronze or something like that, so whether it's stone or bronze or some kind of a polished metal, whatever they would have had in the Bronze Age or in the time of Paul, you would have seen a very faint reflection of yourself in that mirror. You can't think of a glass mirror where you see an exact replication of yourself or reflection of yourself. You got to think in the ancient mirror. You're seeing a shadowy, kind of a blobby representation of yourself. But in the King James Version, we see as through a glass darkly or dimly. That is explaining exactly the visual impairment of cataracts. That's exactly what cataracts is. Cataracts, you get a film over your eye and you're forced to see through that film. So everything you're looking at is kind of, there's a haze over everything. You're seeing through like a dirty glass, basically. Paul is describing what you might think of as a what I call in my book a perceptual cataracts that we have because of the fall. In fact, Paul later goes on to explain what the remedy is, that this perceptual cataracts that we have, he calls the imperfect, and that we're going to see this way until we put on the perfect. And that happens at the resurrection. So when we begin to realize that the resurrection is the rectification of the human condition, this fallen condition, this condition of perceptual cataracts and everything else, death, disease, and everything else that comes with the curse of sin, the wages of sin, when we understand that the rectification, when I say rectification, I mean the remedy, let's say, of our condition is the resurrection. Because when we're resurrected in Christ, we're reset to the blueprint of Adam. So you can imagine all of our defects, all of our genetic, we're still going to be us. In fact, we're going to be more human at the resurrection than we are now. We'll get into that later. So at the resurrection, all of our defects, and I'm getting into the hyperdimensional stuff here by starting from this point. At the resurrection, all of our defects, all of our impairments, including our perceptual cataracts, are going to be removed. You might picture it as, for those familiar with Star Trek, when they beam people in the transport, everybody knows what I'm talking about. In a lot of those episodes, they use the transporter to filter out some kind of a disease or something and reset the person back to an earlier copy of themselves. For the Trekkies out there, that might help them understand that. And that's what happens to us at the resurrection. So all the imperfections, all of everything that is a result of the fall is filtered out at the resurrection, and we're remade. We're still us. We're remade, but without our imperfections, without the human condition, which is degeneration, corruption, and ultimately death. So all of that is filtered out at the resurrection, and we are going to be perfectly human without any defects. We're going to be Adam again. We're going to be unblemished human beings with the full potential and the full abilities that we were supposed to have from the beginning. And so when we understand that, we realize that Adam was created as a perfect person, perfect human being. He didn't even know sin in the beginning. He was sinless. And there was no death. He was immortal, living in the presence of God in Eden. And it wasn't until the fall that he began to degenerate. As soon as he transgressed, he began to degenerate because he was divorced from the family of God. He was expelled from the family and where the tree of life is, where that sustenance, that life-giving sustenance is. And he is expelled from the house of God like the prodigal son, although the prodigal son, does it of his own accord. Adam begins to degenerate. He begins to find himself in a state of destitution, squalor, and depravity. That's us. And so part of that destitution, squalor, and depravity, because we're divorced from the family and we're now reaping the wages of sin, and you and I are now copies from Adam with all kinds of genetic defects. We have all kinds of problems, both physical and spiritual, okay? And so one of the problems that I believe we have as the human species, fallen, is perceptual cataracts. And what I mean by that, and I'm not just talking about obviously our physical eyes, although our physical eyes are probably a lot less effective than they used to be thousands of years ago. I'm talking about our ability to perceive the dimensional totality of created order is incredibly hampered by this degenerate copy of Adam that I'm wearing. So I believe that Adam, in his original state before the fall, was able to perceive and indeed traffic in the dimensional totality of created order, which means that he could freely converse with his older brothers, that he could freely interact in the household of God with the brothers and the servants. He was created for fellowship. And so Adam was equipped as a human being with, I believe, all kinds of remarkable abilities, Maybe some abilities that we attribute today to our comic book superheroes. I'm not saying that he was flying around in a cape and he had lasers coming out of his eyes, but certainly, certainly if you were to cut Adam's hand and you were to cut my hand with a knife, Adam's hand would probably regenerate very quickly. Mine would take weeks. His probably would regenerate even after the fall. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. The machinery of our biology would have been performing at peak level or near peak level in the antediluvian age. Okay, and now it's all clunked down and it's all degraded, and you might envision, the gears that are all rusted and just the whole mechanism is clunky and old. That's us. Okay, so I wanted to lay all that before we talk about this idea of hyperspace and a hyperspatial universe in which, and by the way, hyperspace is simply a dimension of the world that we cannot see, we can't perceive. It's not a separate universe. A lot of people confuse this, that an additional dimension to the fabric of our reality is it's not a separate world. It's not an alternate universe. So we're talking about spaces, that extra dimensional spaces, and I use this as an example in the book. It's more like an extra spatial environment in which your soul resides, for example. So it's an environment that we're already inhabiting. I make this case in my book, but one that we cannot perceive because of our cataracts, our perceptual cataracts, because of the fall. We can't perceive it, even though we're inhabiting it. And that is a distinct concept from this idea of multi-dimensions or alternative universes. Those are other ideas. And so I believe that there are hyperdimensions, that there are extraspatial environments enveloped in that are naturally a part of nature. And the problem isn't that we can't access them so much. The problem is more that we can't perceive them. That's the problem, because our consciousness, our souls reside somewhere. And I don't think it's in our gray brain matter. And I don't think it's in our spleen or any of our organs or intestines or something like that. I think the soul, the consciousness, resides in an extra spatial compartment, a seat for the soul that is part and parcel with human biology, an appendage, if you will, a hyperdimensional appendage that is part of our biology that is created as the seat to house our soul. And it is into that compartment that I believe that demonic entities intrude. Remember that after the resurrection, we're going to see Christ as he is and be seen by him, right? So all of this is going to be rectified at the resurrection. Our eyes are, imagine that moment for us who believe in Christ, who continue in our faith until the end, who are a part of the resurrection. We're resurrected to new life. Again, we're not resurrected to become some other kind of creature. We're not resurrected to be, ethereal beings. We know exactly what we're going to be at the resurrection. How do we know? Because we have the resurrected Christ, who is a prototype of what we're going to be. I mean, Christ is the example of what we're going to be. We're going to be like him. And the apostles make this vividly clear in the New Testament. We are going to be like him. And you have Christ who rises from the grave. He is resurrected. He is the first fruits of many brethren, of many others, us, and all of those who would believe in him, and all of those before him, the patriarchs and the prophets and the men of faith who died before Christ redeemed us on the cross. Christ appears to his apostles who were gathered together in a house, appears to them out of nowhere. Boom, he just appeared like he walks through the wall, right? So here's Christ. Again, this is going to be us at the resurrection. That's how we have to look at it. After the resurrection, Christ walks through the wall or appears in their midst, and they're freaked out because, they think he's a ghost. What does he say to them immediately? Touch me. Touch me. See that I have flesh and bone. Jesus wasn't a phantasm. He wasn't a specter. You know what he was? He was a human being. He had flesh and bone, and they touched him. He had flesh and bone. And then to further validate his corporeal reality, that he's got a physical human body, he says to them, this is intriguing to me, do you have something to eat? And he didn't say that because he was hungry. He said it because he was going to further prove to them that he was like them. He was a human being. They gave him some bread and some fish, and it says in the scriptures that he ate it in front of them. He ate it in their midst. So they're watching. Here, Jesus walks through the wall, post-resurrection, walks through the wall. They're freaking out. They think he's a ghost. Then they touch him, and they can even see the marks in his hands where the nails were, or in his wrists, wherever it was. They can see the markings of the crucifixion. Apparently, Jesus has scars. And then he sits down and eats bread and fish in front of them, chews on it, eats it, swallows it right in front of them for the express purpose to demonstrate to them that he is the second Adam. He's not a different creature now. He's not an ethereal being. He is the rectification of the human condition. And he's eating and drinking, and he's got flesh and blood, but yet he walks through a wall. So you have to put that whole picture together. And when you put that whole picture together, you realize that human beings were created to be a lot more spectacular than we are right now. And that we not only could perceive these extra spatial environments, but like I said, we could traffic in them, like Christ, the resurrected Christ. And so we don't realize the full spectrum of the dimensional totality that is encompassing us, in which we are a part. It's not a separate world. It's not a separate reality. There's not a world for angels and demons and then a world for us. We all are inhabiting the same world, the same universe, and the laws that govern it are the laws that are governing everything that were established from the beginning of time. We're going to see ourselves as Plato's prisoners chained up in the cave, viewing the world, the universe, as shadows on a wall. That's how we're going to see ourselves. That's what we are right now. We are condemned to see the world in shadows because of the fall. I come from the perspective that man was not created with the universe. He was created into the universe, not with it. Into the world, not with it. Whereas a lot of Christians come from the opposite perspective, that man was brought into existence with the universe. So man's origin, his existence, was a part of that original creation. That is born, I believe, and I explain this in the book, but that is born of, I believe, of what is called the anthropocentric perspective. The anthropocentric perspective, anthropocentric meaning man-centered, the human-centered perspective of the universe. It places man at the center of all things, like the hub and the wheel. And so a lot of Christians read the scriptures through an anthropocentric perspective. And so they cannot imagine a scenario in which man is not at the center of what's happening. Born from that perspective, I believe, is the notion that man was created with the earth. I don't hold to an anthropocentric perspective, and I don't believe that an anthropocentric perspective is biblical. I believe clearly the scriptures present what's called a Christocentric perspective, that Christ is the center of all things, not man. In other words, the Son of God is the center of the universe. He's the hub of the wheel, not us. When you begin to contemplate the universe from a Christocentric perspective, you can liberate your mind from certain constraints that are necessary within the anthropocentric perspective. Actually, a lot of constraints. Once you shift your focus and you realize that everything revolves around the Son of God, everything. And that's not Tim Alberino's theology. That's the disciples, that's the apostles' theology that they clearly articulate in the New Testament. They say, several apostles make it explicitly clear that Christ is the center of all things, that the universe was created, all things, seen and unseen, visible and invisible, were created by him and through him and for him. And in him all things consist. Jesus, talking about Jesus, the Son of God. So there's your Christocentric perspective right there. Everything was created by him and through him. And these are all different dynamics, by the way, by him, through him, and for him. The universe wasn't created for us. The earth wasn't created for us. We weren't even created for us. Everything was created for him. That is the correct biblical perspective. Man is not the center of the universe. We are not the first, and we are not the best and the brightest in terms of our biological composition, let's say. I believe that mankind showed up not at the beginning of the timeline, but somewhere along the timeline of all history, known and unknown. I believe that the beginning of that timeline is way before the sixth day creation of mankind. And I think that this is clear in the Bible. I mean, if the sons of God shouted for joy when the earth was created, then obviously they existed before us. Why in the world would we think that they only existed, moments before us? So the sons of God were created, and then suddenly they start shouting for joy when they see the earth get created? That's nonsensical. It's nonsensical. I think what we have here are the contours of a very, very deep and unknown, unsung history, unsung past. We know nothing about it. The Bible, I believe, hints to it. And I don't believe that there is a pre-Adamic controversy. I think that a pre-Adamic reality is assumed, is presumed in the narrative in the biblical narrative. And I find it to be a very strange thing that we try and cram everything to fit into a time period in which we're around, right? And that makes us the center of all things and the purpose of all things. And it's just not the correct perspective. And you can unchain yourself from that perspective by simply focusing instead of on Adam and mankind as the primary protagonist in the scriptures, and instead understanding it's not us, it's Jesus, it's Christ, it's the Son of God. He is the center of all things. He's the why. He answers every question. That's why I call Jesus the singularity, because I start from there. Christ is the center of all things, and then I work my way forward. When you begin, again, to contemplate this idea of the family, there's a Son of God, and then there's the sons of God, and that there's the older sons of God, and then there's the younger sons of God. Well, the fact that there's an older brother, how come, if Jesus didn't want to convey this idea of an older brother, he could have said there were twin brothers, or not even say that one was older and one was, they're just brothers. But in reality, there is an older brother, and that infers the passage of time. These are just logical deductions, and people get all up in arms, and I don't understand why. If you got a different opinion about the so-called gap theory, so what? For me, you anchor yourself on the gospel of Christ. That's the anchor. You don't squabble about the pre-Adamic age or flat earth or some other issue that is not central to the gospel. Neither of those things are central to the gospel, by the way. The gospel doesn't stand or fall on the age of the earth, and it doesn't stand or fall on the shape of the earth. That's not the crux of the gospel. The crux of the gospel is the redemption, the reconciliation, and the restoration of Adam. That's the crux of the gospel in Christ. To make it anything else is a bastardization of the gospel. From my perspective, it's very clear. It's abundantly evident to me that there's a whole lot of time behind Adam. And why shouldn't there be? Why shouldn't there be? And I think that there was, in fact, a massive conflict in the cosmos and in the solar system. In fact, in this solar system, there's a massive conflict. And the Bible hints at this conflict. You alluded to an asteroid belt. David Flynn is the one who really got me thinking about this. And David his book is really what kind of pulled a lot of this stuff together for me. The Secret Chronicles of Mars, Cydonia. I believe that there was a planet between Mars and Jupiter, which is now the asteroid belt. And the Bible designates this planet, I believe, as Rahab. And I don't just, say that in passing. I think I demonstrate that. And at least I think I present a very strong case that is in fact what it's talking about. And it's building on the case that Flynn and others had laid before me. I just sort of expound on some of that. And so I do believe that there was a massive conflict, that this conflict, and when I say conflict, I'm talking about kinetic war. There was a kinetic war in the universe. And it was a war between the kingdom of heaven and the insurgency. This insurgent faction that broke off and began to have conflict with the kingdom, and it erupted in a galactic battle, or a series of galactic battles. And I think in the midst of these battles, Consequence of this conflict, Rahab exploded. And the explosion of Rahab reaped unimaginable destruction in the solar system. Unimaginable destruction, laid waste all of the kingdoms of the pre-Adamic age. And when I use the word pre-Adamic because it's a very apt explanation. There were no humans. It's pre-us. It's a very good term. It's pre-Adam. And again, I don't see what the controversy is. I really don't. I fail to see the controversy. And it's the same with this argument of how old the earth is. Why should that be a controversy? If you think the earth is young, fine. If you think the earth is old, fine. But don't go accusing people of being heretics or not believing the Bible because they take one stance or the other. That's divisive and it's foolish. And those are the kind of things that you'll answer for. At the end of the day, you're gonna answer for how you treat your brothers more than anything else. That was the commandment of Christ, that you would love one another. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't disagree. You can disagree, but you disagree in an appropriate way, not accusing each other of essentially of treason, right? So the age of the earth is really inconsequential to the gospel, but it's intriguing to me because it really helps me to contemplate this vast universe of time and history that is behind us, way behind us, and understand that any civilization that was inhabiting the earth before Adam or Mars or Venus or any of these other planets would have been like wax, it says in various places. And in some of those places, it's referring to Rahab and so there's a connection with Rahab and there's a connection to conflict. Okay. The mountains, they melted like wax. To melt rock like wax, that's extreme heat. And it's the kind of heat you might expect if a planet explodes, right? And there's this massive, we can't comprehend that big of an, in Star Wars, the Death Star blows up a planet and, it's not like that. It's way more devastating than anything we could even depict. We can't even comprehend the destruction that something like that would reap in the solar system. And it might have, all of the planets in our solar system, by the way, might have all been situated in the so-called Goldilocks zone. And then boom, when that planet exploded, they were flung out, pushed apart. Maybe that's one possibility. There's many possibilities regarding the position of the planet. So, and just us talking about planets and the earth and so forth is going to get a lot of people ticked off, right? Because that's the way it is in 2020. There is no pre-Adamic controversy as far as I'm concerned. I think it's inferred. I think it's assumed in the narrative of Scripture. And by the way, in Scriptures regarding Rahab, he stills the raging sea, stilling and calming the raging sea over and over and over, that Yahweh stills and calms the sea. And this is why people think that Yahweh was a God of storms or God of the sea, right? Because he's always stilling and calming the sea, right? I don't think that's what the Bible is telling us, that Yahweh is this, was depicted as a God of storms or whatever. I think that stilling and calming the sea, I think, is a clear metaphor for stilling and quelling insurrection. And I think that's clear. When I say insurrection, I'm talking about rebellion. He stills the sea. He put down the rebellion. When its waves rise, you still them. You shattered Rahab. You pierced the dragon. You shattered Rahab like a clay vessel. And, these are martial expressions. This is kinetic war. This isn't like spiritual war. Again, I kind of talk about that in the book too, because it kind of irritates me. People talk about spiritual war like it's something else. No. Kinetic war. Armageddon is a kinetic war. Armageddon is a kinetic war. And the conflict that happened in the pre-Adamic past was a kinetic war, the likes of which we can't imagine. You have, and I'm probably getting ahead of you, but you have, in the Bible, you have Jesus depicted, the Son of God depicted, marching on the field of Edom, a great warrior, a warrior king who's putting down the insurrection and slaying his foes, right? And this victorious king who's marching against his enemies. And then you have the depiction of Jesus returning, at Armageddon. His robe is dipped in blood. And once again, it's this idea that he's coming back. He's marching on the battlefield to make war with his enemies. This is not a war of just prayers and spiritual warfare or something like that. This is kinetic war, military armaments and armies. And I don't think, by the way, that the soldiers that are returning with Christ are riding horses. I have a different view. I have people can take it or leave it. People can think it's great, or they can call me any name they want. But the point is that from start to finish, the true narrative of my book, if you want to ask me, what is your book about? My book is about the gospel of Christ. That's what my book is about, from start to finish. And I think that becomes abundantly clear when you get to the last chapter. I think that the Garden of Eden is like a lot of the ancient writing. The story of the Garden of Eden is meant to encapsulate information. It's not meant to be read literally, in my opinion. And I think there are obviously some, it does constitute to some degree an element of history, but obviously there was I believe in Adam and Eve. I believe Adam was the first man and Eve the first woman. But the narrative, the way that the story of the Garden of Eden is written is very interesting. It's very esoteric, and esoteric by design. And people sometimes don't like to hear that, but it doesn't matter. I mean, if you read the Bible, much of the Bible is prophecy, and prophecy by design, by nature, is esoteric. That's what prophecy is. An oracle is by design esoteric. It has to be unpacked. It has to be understood. It has to be contemplated and understood in a particular context. And I think that that is the way that the Garden of Eden story is written. It presents us with some key details. We're given an outline, an understanding of what's happening. And I think that it does, in fact, require some unpacking to truly understand what is being depicted. I don't think that this is a foreign concept. We all know that most of us are aware at this point, surely most people in your audience, that the snake in the garden wasn't an actual snake, wasn't, like a boa constrictor or something like that. I think most people realize that this is a bipedal entity, that this is an entity that is being depicted, being represented with the figure of a snake, but is not in effect, in actuality, a snake. And so right there, I mean, if you accept that idea, that notion that the snake is not actually a snake, it's a being, you need to then further extrapolate the rest of the story. Because if the snake is being depicted, if the being is being depicted, this being who I think looks like probably a blonde-haired, 30-something-year-old man with blue eyes and radiant skin, and that's what I think that being looked like, the snake in the garden. We need to then understand that other things in the story, are representations, are iconographic, and should be then interpreted rather than just read as literal objects or characters and so forth. But again, I'm not saying that the story is not talking about Adam, the first man. I believe absolutely it is talking about Adam, the first man. I have a very different take on the Garden of Eden. It's hard for me to recall because and you've read it, it's very technical. It's hard for me to recall all the technical information that I record in the book. But my take on the Garden of Eden is that I don't believe that the Garden of Eden was ever on earth. Again, I have to commend the work of David Flynn, the late David Flynn here, because David Flynn made a statement one time that just really floored me, offended me at first, and that's often what happens when your paradigm is shaken and shattered. It starts with offense. And David said that he thought that the Garden of Eden might not have been on Earth. I think he posited that it might have been on Mars, actually, David Flynn. And I was pretty shaken by that because it caused me to kind of have to let go of some of my Sunday school perceptions, which at this point I'm very, very happy that I did, because my understanding of the gospel and of the story of mankind is much deeper now, because I was able to let go of some of those, what I call Sunday school perceptions. I got to thinking about the Garden of Eden, what it might represent. And then if the Bible tells us what it represents, I think it makes it pretty clear, because you have three terms that are used interchangeably. I have somewhere in my book an equation to the effect that, you have heaven equals paradise equals Eden. I think that's the way I put it in my book. And those are the three concepts that are ubiquitous and are analogous, I should say, in the Bible, appear to be analogous. In fact, I would add another one, the Father's house. Again, reminding people that Jesus said, in my Father's house are many rooms. So you have the Father's house, you have heaven, you have paradise, and you have Eden. So either these are all distinct places or they're all the same place. I believe they're all the same place. These are all the same place. We're talking about the Father's house, where the Father dwells. So was the Father's house is paradise on earth? Because Eden and paradise are used interchangeably in several places in the scriptures. Okay, and in the extra-biblical text. So Eden and paradise are the same thing. Is paradise and heaven the same thing? I think so. You have to start to wonder, if heaven is paradise is Eden, then how could Eden have been on earth? How could Eden have been on earth? Are we saying then that the paradise of God is on earth? No, I think that's evident it's not. It's not on earth, never was. Why does the Bible appear to give us coordinates for the Garden of Eden? This is, of course, what people use to make the claim that Eden was obviously a place on earth. It had a physical location, an address on earth, because it talks about 4 rivers and it talks about, the gold in that land is good and so forth. But I think that what's being communicated is something much more profound than a physical address on earth. I think there is a physical address, but I don't think it's to paradise itself. I think the physical address is to the gate that leads to paradise. And, what you would consider, what you might consider a stargate. I talk about this concept that's known as an axis mundi. Before people go accusing me of being a New Age person or something like that, the concept of an axis mundi, it's just another way of saying a stargate or a portal. But the axis mundi is very, very ancient concept, very ancient. I think probably as ancient as the story of Eden itself. And an axis mundi is a place of convergence. It's the place where the cosmic waters converge. And this idea of the cosmic waters is a Mesopotamian concept. That the Canaanites and then going all the way back to the Sumerians, they have this concept that there was a location, a very specific location on Earth, or several, but definitely one in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, very specific location where the cosmic waters converged. And it was at this place where the waters converged that you could gain access to other realms. Again, what we would call in modern parlance, sci-fi parlance, what we would call a stargate. Right? A gateway that gives access into multiple realms. And I use this illustration in my book. Those who are familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia will recall in The Magician's Nephew, Diggory and Polly are the 2 protagonists, and they put on these rings that their uncle had fabricated, had manufactured, and these rings would allow them to access an axis mundi. For those familiar with the story, the wood between the worlds was a serene, tranquil place. It wasn't necessarily a world in itself. It was a place, it was an in-between place. It was a place between the worlds. And you could access these other realms, not other dimensions, other realms within the universe, if you had this ring on, and you could access the realms through pools of water on the ground. For those, again, who've read the book, this is going to be very familiar to them. So Diggory and Polly, to get into these other realms, they would jump into the pools of water. And interestingly enough, one of the realms that they visit that ends up being the source of a lot of problems in Narnia later on, one of them was an evil realm. It was a realm that was destroyed. Remember, it was destroyed. It was just totally laid waste. And they went into this building, and long story short, there were these kings and queens that were kind of frozen, like were stone, right? And they ended up somehow, I don't even remember how, they ended up unfreezing one of them, which ended up being the White Witch, whatever her name was in the books. I can't remember her actual name. And she ended up following them back into Narnia, right? Which is, by the way, I think that Tolkien, I mentioned Tolkien last, I think Tolkien and Lewis, we're thinking along a lot of the same lines here. No surprise that I would pick some of this stuff up, because I was a huge fan of first Lewis and then Tolkien growing up. And probably a lot of people listening to this were too, before the movies. Anyway, I think that what I was about to say was that I think that was a little bit, again, as a little bit of a wink from C.S. Lewis concerning Mars, that the White Witch came from, right? That was laid waste, that was desolate and empty and laid waste. Tohu vabohu, so to speak. This enemy of Narnia ends up coming into Narnia through a portal and so forth. And people can go back and play with those ideas and, go back to the Magician's Nephew and remind themselves of that scenario. So back to the axis mundi. The axis mundi, that's an illustration of how an axis mundi might work. It's a place between the worlds. It's a gateway that gives you access to different realms. And an axis mundi is often represented all across the earth, by the way. This is ubiquitous across the earth. It's a universal representation, usually represented as a tree, as a world tree. And people have seen this representation of a world tree. Sometimes it's in a circular formation. And of course, the branches are reaching to the heaven. to the heavens. The trunk is fixated on the earth, is fixed on the earth. And then, of course, the roots go down under the earth. And so what that represents is this three-tiered cosmology. And it's not a literal cosmology, by the way. It's just a three-tiered depiction of, it's like you were saying the other day, that, a circle within a square or something like that. It's us understanding a very complex thing in a very simplistic way. So you have the tree, and you have the branches reaching up to the heavens, which represents the heavenly realm. Then you have the trunk of the tree, which represents the earthly realm. And then you have the roots of the tree, which represents the underworld. And this three-tiered cosmology is all over the place. I mean, it's in the Inca had this three-tiered cosmology it's represented all over Peru and all over what was the Incan Empire, and lots of different symbols. And they called this the Hanan Pacha, which was the realm above. And then you have the Uku Pachas, the underworld, and then the Kai Pacha, which is the surface of the earth. So you got the Hanan Pacha, the Kai Pacha, and the Uku Pacha. The heavens, the earth, and the underworld, right? So this is the idea. And the reason why I'm going through this long explanation is to say, again, that the Mesopotamians believed that there is a place where the waters converge, these realms, where the cosmic waters converge, where you can have access to these realms. Very, very interesting, the connection here with C.S. Lewis and the wood between the worlds, where the realms were connected by pools of water. So it's kind of this Mesopotamian idea. And that this particular place that the Mesopotamians believed that this Stargate happens to be on the summit of Mount Hermon. And so Hermon was where the cosmic waters converged, right? And so, long story short, I believe that the gate to Eden was on the summit of Hermon. I don't believe that Eden is on Mars. I believe that Eden is in paradise. Eden is paradise. And I believe that gate, that Adam had access to paradise before the gates were shut. And we know that the gates were shut. And we know that there were cherubim placed in front of the gates to guard the way to the tree of life, to shut out access to paradise. And I don't believe that those beings are guarding the tree of life, the access way, the gateway to the tree of life. They're not simply there to prohibit human beings from accessing the tree of life. I think they're also there guarding the gateway from the members of the insurgency from entering paradise and having access. So no, I don't believe that. I do not believe that Eden is on Mars. I don't believe that paradise is on Mars. I don't know where paradise is, but it's somewhere. The axis mundi is represented oftentimes. It's also represented by the convergence of the four cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. It's the intersection point between the four cardinal directions. That's one of the symbols of the axis mundi. And what do we have in the description of Eden? Four rivers that converge. And by the way, we know that these rivers are converging, according to the description given in the book of Genesis, at a high place. Why? Because they flow down into the land, surrounding land. And so we're being given information here that I think needs to be unpacked. So you have the convergence of four rivers. Again, water converging, the Mesopotamian idea of the waters converging, giving way to this axis mundi. And then it was on the top of Hermon, of course, where the gods were thought to have held court. And so this was a place where the gods would be in repose, holding court. And it was a place where you could have access to the gods, where man at one time had interaction with the gods. Mount Olympus, remember, with the Greeks. And then you have Mount Muru, and you have all these different ideas of access to the gods on the top of a mountain. This is why we have the step pyramids. This is why we have the ziggurats. This is why we have the different pyramidal structures around the earth that are representations of mankind having access to the gods. That access was obviously, it's a recollection of Adam, in my opinion. It's a recollection of where we began. And so obviously it was paganized, and I'm not saying that the ziggurats and stuff and that the Mesopotamian gods are the gods that Adam was interacting with. So people, don't need to hear what I'm not saying. I'm talking about Adam walking in the cool of the day with the Maker. That's what I'm talking about. I don't know if there were literal trees or literal fruit. There very well may have been. I don't know. But I do know that the tree of life is representative of Christ, of Jesus. That's apparent in the Bible, and that the tree of knowledge is representative of Satan, of the adversary. I mean, I think those are concepts that should be very familiar to Christians. Jesus is the tree of life. He is the way. He's the doorway back into Eden. He's the gate. You can't go to the Father but through him. And so He's the one who gives us access to the tree of life. To those who overcome, he says in the book of Revelation, he will give them access to eat of to the tree of life, to eat of the tree of life. I talk about two, I don't want to get in trouble here for getting to technicalities of what I wrote, but I don't invent two words, but I invent a new way of thinking about immortality. I present a very different way to think about immortality. I talk about intrinsic and extrinsic immortality. It's very interesting when we start to contemplate immortality, because what exactly is immortality? And people are wondering, who are listening to this, of course, we know what immortality, it means, you live forever. Okay, fine. What are the intricacies here? I mean, intrinsic means something that is innate, right? Something that's inherent. So if you have an intrinsically immortal being, that's a being that was created to be immortal, that is created as an immortal being. In other words, a being that by nature of its very existence, its very creation, it is immortal. It cannot die, right? And then you have what I call extrinsic immortality, which is an immortality that is contingent on some external factor. Extrinsic immortality would be someone who is immortal, someone who is able to live forever because they have access, for example, to, let's say, fruit from a tree, right? So as soon as they no longer have access to that fruit, they start to die. That is what I call extrinsic immortality. It's contingent on the fruit of the tree. So if you shut them off from access to that fruit, they begin to die. They are not inherently immortal. You have this very interesting scenario here where the Elohim are saying, we can't let Adam have access to the tree of life anymore. Now that he's committed this transgression, he's done something here with this being, this evil being that's tempted him. And so now, because of this transgression, he can't have access. He can't be here anymore in paradise. And by the way, and remember, I think that paradise is the house of God. Okay, he can't be here with us anymore in this condition. And so now we need to shut him out, lest he continue to have access to take from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Have access and take like us, basically, is what they're saying. I believe that the Son of God is the King and the Maker. The Bible tells us that he is the Maker, that all things were created through him, specifically through him, and by him and for him, like we talked about last time. So he is the head. He's the chief. There's this council around him. There's these other beings. And so the question is, are they intrinsically immortal, or are they extrinsically immortal? Like us, we're extrinsically immortal according to the scriptures. Our immortality is contingent on something. And obviously that's true, because we're not, when we were banished, exiled from Eden, we began to die, which was not our condition in Eden. And so the question is, what about these other beings? If they're exiled from Eden, do they begin to die? I think it's a fair question. I contemplate it. Don't spend a whole lot of time on it in the book. I certainly posit the question. It's very interesting to think about that. Now, let me say this very clearly, that Jesus, who I call the singularity, we talked about that last time, is intrinsically immortal. The Father and his Son are intrinsically immortal. I think it's Paul who says this, and I quote this in my book, that only God has immortality, truly has immortality. And so I believe that outside of God, all other beings are extrinsically immortal. Their immortality is contingent on something. So I'm not saying that that God is not intrinsically immortal. Indeed, quite the opposite. He alone has immortality, true immortality, and cannot die no matter what. Everything else, I think, is contingent on whatever this factor is that provides for eternal life and rejuvenation in paradise. So, I talk a little bit about is this where we get maybe some of this idea of vampires, right? Vampires who suck blood and who can live perpetually as long as they have this access to this sustenance, and vampires in the context of the insurgency of the bad guys, right? That maybe maybe that's why there's cherub guarding the way to the tree of life. They're not guarding the way for me. I don't even know where it is, right? We could spend the rest of our lives hunting around the Middle East, around Mesopotamia, and we'd never find Eden. So why do you need cherub there, right? We can't even see it. I don't think we can perceive it anymore. We talked about perceptual cataracts I don't think we can perceive the gate anymore. But it's probably still there, and it's being guarded against who? Against us? Well, we can't see it anymore. But I'll bet that Satan can, and his insurgents, his forces. And so that's who it's being guarded from gaining entry. Part of the plan is to get back in there and have access again. So I write in here in my book, the primordial condition of Adam's extrinsic immortality allows us to answer two contradictory questions in the affirmative. Was man designed to die? Yes. Was man intended to live forever? Yes. And so that might confuse people, but it transitions us into this next topic. And then I write, as a biological creature, man was designed with a mortal body subject to entropy. As a son of God, he was intended to eat of the tree of life and live forever as a member of the divine family. And what I mean by divine family is that's what Adam was a son of God. So I mean in the family of God. Jesus says, in my Father's house are many rooms, and I'm going there to prepare a place for you. And if I'm going there to prepare a place for you, I'll come back and take you there so that you may be where I am. Where's he taking us? In the Father's house, in the family, right? So, and I'm not saying that we're gods, none of that garbage. I don't subscribe to any of that. We are not gods. We're human beings made in the image of God. I don't want people to mistake me for that, because I don't like that doctrine. I abhor that doctrine, actually. Entropy is at work in the universe, and you can't escape it. And I believe that the universe is like a clock. It was wound up, and now it's winding down. And I believe that perspective from cosmologists, astrophysicists is absolutely accurate. I believe that they're identifying a mechanism that God created, put into place from the beginning. Originally, everything was created through the maker, through the creator. It had a timestamp on it, that this present creation has a timestamp, and it's winding down. It's like the ticking hand on a clock. And at some point, it's going to strike midnight, right? And I believe that this is precisely why a new heavens and a new earth is made. This one is wearing out like an old garment, according to the scriptures. It's wearing out like a garment. And that is actually the best way to explain entropy in this context. Entropy has a couple of different definitions depending on what you're talking about. But you can think of entropy in exactly the way the Bible describes it. It is the universe is where the fabric of the universe is wearing out. That's evident in our bodies, and it's evident in the natural world. And so thousands and thousands of years ago, I think that nature, living things were much more robust than they are now. I think that's evident too in the fossil record. You see larger creatures and so forth. Everything had longer lifespans, and there wasn't as much, certainly there wasn't as much genetic disease. And so, there wasn't as much genetic degeneration. We are everything, not just human beings. All life is suffering this gradual decline in our genomes. We're all suffering a increase in entropy and genetic entropy, and which is degeneration in our genomes. And so, like I say in the book, and like I said at the conference back in 2018, I think, or 17, to put it bluntly, all of us, me, you, and everybody listening, we are all really crappy versions of Adam. We're really crappy copies of Adam, is what we are. And that's a fact, Jack. You could take that to the bank, okay? There's nobody who can dispute that. There's no scientist who can dispute the fact genetic decline, successive genetic decline. In fact, population geneticists have identified this and are actually quietly alarmed by it, realizing that the rate of degeneration in our genome is increasing as we go along. We're getting worse. I talk about the fact that the reason why in the modern age it's not so apparent anymore is because we have a crutch of technology. We have a technological prop. But if that crutch were kicked out from under us, we would realize really fast how degenerate we are. There's 10,000 known genetic diseases and growing. The number's growing all the time. We look back 100 years ago, the life expectancy was like, what was it, 40 years old or something like that? If you take into consideration even less than that, it was like 40 years old. Even if you take into consideration the the infant mortality rate, which was high at the time. Men were living like into their 40s, and women were living like into their 50s or something like that when you factor out the infant mortality. That was not the case thousands of years ago. That was not the case. We know, those of us who believe in the Bible know that in the antediluvian world, human beings were living very long. It makes sense. It makes perfect sense. They were much more genetically robust than we are. Their biology was working a lot better than ours. And so naturally, a result of that would be that you're going to have more longevity. You're going to have more longevity. You're going to be much more physically, mentally robust than we are today. And so this is just a fact of nature. By the way, the population geneticists are quietly alarmed because they know that we are headed for an apocalyptic scenario, which they call error catastrophe. Error catastrophe is basically, in layman's terms, it's the point at which the genome becomes so corrupted, so degenerate, that we're no longer viable. We're no longer reproductively viable. We're so screwed up. It's like a mechanism that's breaking down slowly breaking down until it's just broken beyond repair. And that factors into some of the stuff that you're going to encounter at the end of the book, because I think that somebody's going to show up and offer to repair our genome with their own genetic material. But we're getting ahead of ourselves now. I do know that population geneticists are quietly alarmed. They're quietly alarmed. We're getting to a point here where, our technology is going to have to start to supplement in a much more significant way our genetic weakness. There's a book called Genetic Entropy by Dr. Sanford, who was the inventor of the gene gun, and he worked, I believe, at Cornell. And he wrote a book called Genetic Entropy, and he's a believer. Fantastic book. I think his work is unimpeachable. He's a top-notch geneticist. The guy knows what he's talking about. This is what I call the atrophy of Adam. This is the result of the fall, the wages of sin. These are the wages of sin. I think clearly what you have, Adam being a son of God, in the household of God, in the counsel of God, and that he is the regent of the earth, and that his charge is to govern the earth. And that Adam was supposed to was supposed to expand the kingdom of heaven on earth. A lot of us believe that. There's been a lot of books and a lot of great writers who've written about this in the past. This isn't a new idea, but I think it's absolutely correct that Adam was charged with. He was the regent of the earth. He represented the kingdom of heaven. He was to spread out on the earth and to create an earthly kingdom that was an extension of the kingdom of heaven. And whether people like it or not, I said it offends people. I'll say it again, and that is that the kingdom of heaven is very much like an empire. And the word empire, this isn't some evil, everybody, when I say empire, they probably think of Darth Vader. An empire is just a kind of government, and an empire encompasses a lot of realms. It encompasses different realms, and each realm has a regent, a procure in the Roman Empire, governors and procures and regents of the emperor who have like small kingdoms that are all enveloped in the empire, right? I think that is an accurate depiction of the kingdom of heaven. And the earth was supposed to be a realm governed by us, by Adam. And by the way, it still is a realm governed by us. We did not, and this is something that I disagree with a lot of people who say that Adam lost his dominion. He did not lose his dominion. Let me tell you something. If Adam lost his dominion, if the human species lost its dominion on earth, we would know it, believe me, because somebody else would be running the show down here. People will say, well, somebody else is running the show. Look how evil, people are. Okay, fine, but it's still us. It's still us. We are still the kings. We are still the governors. We are still the regents. We're still the ones running things on the earth. And we're supposed to rule. We're supposed to govern according to the kingdom of heaven. We're supposed to be good governors. And we're supposed to execute the governance of God in righteousness. And there's a mandate to govern well according to the principles of the kingdom of heaven. And it's when we get away from that, when we get in big trouble. I think I say in my book, there's never been a time when anything other than a human being, in parentheses, or a hybrid human, has ruled on the earth, has occupied a human throne. Because the caveat there is indeed that there has been a time when hybrid humans have ruled the earth, and that this whole idea that I'm talking about, that only mankind has the right to rule on planet Earth. Only mankind has the right to rule on planet Earth. This factors into the very primary theme of my book, which is this idea of a birthright. It is our birthright to govern the earth. And the birthright cannot be stolen from us. It can't be taken away from us by force. It can, however, be abdicated, and it can be usurped. Those are different ideas. To steal something is if you're holding, like, a book in your hand, and I come over and take it from you. I've stolen it from you. I've taken it from you by force. So there's nothing you could do to stop me because I've overpowered you, right? That's one idea. That's stealing something. If you were to give me the book of your own accord, willfully surrender the book to me, that is abdication. Okay? You've abdicated the book to me. That's a different concept entirely. I'm not taking it from you by force. You're abdicating it to me. But there's a third concept, which is a usurpation, which is more complex, which is me taking your place and having the same right that you do to that book. Okay? Those are three different concepts. You can have something stolen, you can abdicate the possession, or it can be usurped. Human authority can be abdicated to the dragon and his minions. Now, that doesn't mean that they have the right to occupy a human throne. No, they don't. Only we have the right. Only the sons of Adam have the right to occupy the thrones of Adam, human thrones, okay? And this is all very clear in the scriptures, and I make it, I demonstrate that the Bible is in fact saying this. So only the sons of Adam can occupy the thrones of Adam, human thrones, okay? However, our authority can be abdicated to whoever we want. And how do we abdicate authority? Idolatry. That's how we abdicate authority. And that's why idolatry is such a dangerous thing. I'm not talking about these weird notions of idolatry like, if I love a TV show too much. No. We've lost. No. That's not idolatry. Idolatry is not, by the way, a lot of people are going to get ticked off at me. I don't care. Be mad at me. Idolatry is not setting up a Christmas tree or something like that. Not idolatry. All right? Idolatry is very specific in the Bible. Idolatry is willfully abdicating and worshiping another entity, another being, worshiping that being as deifying that being, worshiping them, paying obeisance to anybody else except for the Father and his Son. That's it. If you pay obeisance to any other entity besides Yahweh, it's idolatry. And that's it. There's no other definition of idolatry. It's not what you want it to be. That is it. And there's a reason for that. There's a very specific reason why idolatry is such an offense. First of all, it's a slap in the face of the maker, of the king who gave us dominion of the earth. He commissioned us. He gave us dominion of the earth. And for us to abdicate our authority on earth to the enemies of God is a slap in his face, number one. Okay? Number two, it's very dangerous because the only way that the devil can gain authority in our realm is when we give it to him. That's how he gains authority in our realm. That's how the enemy gains influence in our life and in our governments, is when we give it to him. We have to abdicate it. Okay? We have to give authority over to the devil, and that happens through idolatry. Now, even though we may worship the devil in the guise of Jupiter, as the Romans did, or the devil in the guise of Zeus, as the Greeks did, it does not authorize him to occupy a human throne. It doesn't. He never has, and he never will. His son will. We'll get to that later. But he never has, and he never will, because he doesn't have the authority to occupy a human throne. However, we can abdicate our authority to him and allow him influence in our realm. That's the key. When idolatry allows the insurgency, which is the devil and his forces, to have influence in our realm and to operate on a level that is otherwise prohibited, okay? So when you commit idolatry, when your nation openly worships Jupiter, which is just an aspect of Satan, openly worships Jupiter, you have now created an environment over every realm that your empire has governance over. You have created an environment in which the enemy can now have open influence in your realm. Okay? That's idolatry. That's the danger of idolatry. That's why it's such an abomination in the scriptures. It's a slap in the face of God who gave us the dominion of the earth. Number one, slapping him in the face. Yahweh slapping him in the face. And number two, It's allowing his enemies to have influence in our realm. And that influence is demonic influence. That's why he's the prince of the power of the air. And the power of the air, I don't believe that means, like the atmosphere or the stratosphere or whatever. I don't believe that's what it means at all. I think it means the influence, the influence over the zeitgeist of the culture. And that's us. That's us giving him authority. Now, here's a very, very important precept here, okay? If I'm a king, if I'm an emperor, right, and I'm going to extend my empire, my kingdom, I'm going to extend it over into another area. My armies have just conquered this territory, and now I need to govern that territory. What do? I appoint a regent who is going to govern for me, right? I'm going to appoint a regent. So I'm going to authorize that regent. I'm going to give him the authority, my authority, to go to this portion of my kingdom and govern in my name. He needs to have a certificate. He needs to have a seal of my authority. This individual, this regent, needs to be bearing the seal of my authority so that everybody knows I sent him. Number one. And number two, this individual, this regent, needs to have the armies of my kingdom ready to defend the authority that I've given him and to defend that realm. Without those two things, that regent is ineffective. So if that regent shows up to govern this newly conquered area, we've expanded the empire, I sent my regent to govern that part of the kingdom, and he shows up without any kind of signet, without any seal, without any authentication that I indeed sent him, nobody's going to take him seriously. Is anybody going to respect his claim? No. He doesn't have any proof. He's just some guy saying, I am the governor of this realm, right? Or alternatively, if he shows up with authentication, look, I've got the ring, I've got this, here's the seal, here's my deed, and here's the seal of the king, right? Here's my authentication, okay. But if the kingdom doesn't have a standing army, does anybody care? Would anybody care about his claim, I'm here to govern on behalf of the king? Of course not. The first contender would simply sweep in with their army and take over. All right. Now you have to understand that this is the scenario that's happening with us, the regents of the earth. Our authority is enforced on the earth by the armies of the kingdom. Period. Okay? Our authority is enforced by the armies of the kingdom. That's why our enemies, any enemy, can't just come and take over. That's why the devil, for example, can't just show up tomorrow, reveal himself with his legions, and just throw out all the human governors and start to occupy the thrones of men. He does not have the authority, and he can't do it. Why? Because he is being restrained. Okay? So he can't do it because the armies of the kingdom will kick his butt if he tries. All right? It's a very simple concept. We understand this. I mean, this is the way it works in a human context too. Let's backtrack here to the more important issue because we got the armies of the kingdom. Here's the crux of this book, okay? What gives us the authority? What is the seal of our authority as human beings? And I contend that the seal of our authority is the image we bear. That's the seal. It's the image we bear. In my book, I demonstrate how, I was talking about if I'm a king and I send you, my regent, over to govern a realm, I send you with a certificate of authentication that you are my regent. And you bear that certificate. And oftentimes, in most cases, a regent that would be dispatched from a king would be carrying a certificate, either cylinder, if it's way back in the ancient times, Mesopotamians, or let's say, the medieval times, might be carrying a parchment, right? And that parchment or that cylinder will be sealed. It's going to have a seal on it of authentication, okay? If it's a parchment, picture a scroll with the wax seal. And we've all seen this in movies and stuff, and where the king or the pope will put drip a little bit of wax on the rolled up parchment or whatever. It doesn't have to be rolled. And then they'll take their signet ring, usually take their signet ring That's what a signet ring is. And they'll press it down onto the wax, and it will imprint an image. And do you know what that image was? Usually, almost in most cases, it was an image of their likeness. Okay? So if I'm a king, I'm about to give you a certificate of authentication that you are my regent. Okay? Before I give you the certificate, I roll it up, I drip some wax on it, then I take my signet ring, which has my likeness on it. My image, my likeness is on the signet ring. And I take that ring and I press it down into the wax. And I hand you this certificate of authentication that has my likeness sealed on it. That's us. That's Adam. Imagine God creating Adam to have dominion, giving him the title deed of the earth, right? He pictured God, and I know this obviously isn't what happened actually, but as a thought experiment, picture God taking his ring, his seal with his likeness on it, and pressing it into the earthen clay. He sealed us with his image. We literally bear his seal of authentication that we have dominion on the earth. And the image we bear, literally what we look like, this image identifies us. We are identified as those who have authority from the king. Just like that seal on the parchment and you carry that seal on the parchment with you as my regent. If somebody challenges you, you show them that seal. Look, I have authority from the king. And if you cross me, guess what's going to happen? The armies of the kingdom are going to show up, right? That's us. That's our situation on earth. We're made in the likeness of God. We're sealed with his image. I believe that, and that's part of our birthright. And when we replicate that image through reproduction, our children are sealed with Adam's birthright, with the dominion of the earth, with the authority with which God has invested Adam. And it's a collective thing, by the way. And it doesn't just pertain to Christians or Hebrews or something. It's the human race. Okay? And so we're sealed with the image of God. And so then without going too much further into this, kind of giving you a preview of what's coming ahead in the last chapters, what happens when we forfeit the image of God? When we evolve out of Adam, when we become post-human and we surrender the authority of God that is contingent on this seal, the image we bear. What happens? And I answer that question. And I believe that will happen at the end, and that is the machination. That is the Luciferian machination to usurp the authority, the dominion of planet Earth. And that's how it's done. And that, by the way, has happened. It happened one time in the past, and that was at the advent of the Watchers. The Golden Age, universally across the earth, in every major ancient culture on earth, and I say major, I mean like there's a lot of obscure little cultures and stuff that maybe didn't have this mythology, but the big cultures on earth, primary cultures, all told stories about a time when the gods dwelt among men. And those stories usually involve details regarding the gods not only dwelling among men, but copulating with the daughters of men and creating demigods, hybrid demigods. And again, this is ubiquitous across the earth. And it's well known that this Golden Age narrative is mysteriously everywhere. It's universal. And so that's the paganized version. It's when we say Golden Age, because the Golden Age is lauded by the ancient. It's this time of great knowledge. It's this time that's looked back to with longing. Really is what the ancients were looking forward to with longing, that this Golden Age that there would be another advent of the Golden Age on earth. And this is what they were secretly longing for, and not secretly now, the Luciferians and some of these secret societies are secretly longing for and working towards the resurrection, the reinstitution of the Golden Age. But in the ancient world, This was the time of great knowledge in their minds. It was a time before the great cataclysm, usually depicted as a flood. There was a lot of volcanism. There was a lot of seismic activity, the Noahic flood. So it's depicted a little bit different in each culture, but usually as a flood. This golden age was a time before the flood of Noah. Again, in the pagan world, it's a time of great knowledge and peace and prosperity, except the Hebrews. They had a different account. The Hebrews almost stand alone. Their account, their reckoning of the golden age is the polar opposite. They view the golden age as an intrusion of the gods into earth, that the gods wrought corruption and chaos and bloodshed and rebellion, and that it was a time of great suffering. It was a time of war and unrest, the very opposite, the polar opposite of what the pagan account is. And it too ended in a great cataclysm. And of course, that's the flood of Noah. It ended as a result of God's wrath to bring to an end this, what I call the empire of the gods. There's astounding prophecies from the book of Enoch regarding Christ, messianic prophecies. The book of Enoch opens up addressing a generation that would live at the age. You could make the argument that the book of Enoch opens up addressing the generation that will be alive when the flood comes, but I think there's a dual interpretation there, that it's addressing both the impending flood, the cataclysm that's coming at the end of the age, because the cataclysm that's coming at the end of the age is likened to the flood. It might even be the same mechanism that caused the flood, that causes the great cataclysm at the end of the age. It's a different conversation. Yeah, the book of Enoch they're just incredible. I go into a lot of detail about the book of Enoch. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the book of Enoch, but because the messianic content is so prescient and accurate, a lot of people assume that the book of Enoch, that those portions of the book of Enoch must have been written in the age of the apostles or shortly thereafter. But anyway, there's some phenomenal messianic content in the book of Enoch that's undeniable, and it does relate to the events that transpired before the first cataclysm and similar events that are going to transpire before the final cataclysm at the end of the age. The end of the age, by the way, the age in which we are now in. We are in the final age. Yeah, I mentioned the book of the giants, which was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's very fragmented, so we don't really know the full story of the book of giants. It's kind of just highlights and adds some additional information into the general narrative of Genesis 6, the narrative of the book of the Watchers in Enoch. It talks about the Watchers not just corrupting human species, but all different kinds of animal species on earth. And whether that corruption was through direct fornication or whether it was through some kind of germline genetic engineering, I don't know. But I do know that the corruption of the human species was a result of fornication. There's no doubt about that. So whether the angels then went and copulated, whether the sons of God went and copulated with the animals, and I doubt it. I think that was probably some kind of a germline genetic engineering scenario. But let me go back to the beginning, because one of the first thing that I deal with when talking about the fall of the Watchers is what I call, and we mentioned this, I think actually I might have mentioned this to Derek Gilbert, but the fall of the Watchers began with what I call the first cause. What was the first cause of the fall of the Watchers? And I think the first cause of the fall of the Watchers was very clearly lust. They lusted after the daughters of Adam. They saw human women and they lusted. After all, they were watching, they're watchers, and they're looking down and seeing the female counterpart of Adam, the wives of Adam's offspring, of his male offspring. And so they were envious of the men for their wives. So when we talk about the fall of the Watchers, we have to deal with what I call the first cause. And the first cause of the fall of the Watchers is very clearly lust. Whether people like it or not, that's what both the book of Genesis 6 says, and also the book of Enoch, the account of Enoch, and other extra biblical texts. And so the first cause is unequivocally lust. They saw the daughters of Adam and they lusted after them. But that's not all that they did. They lusted after the women, but they also desired to produce their own offspring, which is very important. So I think that there are three primary things that the Watchers coveted, and these were the three primary motivations of the descent of the Watchers. And I'm just going to read them right out of my book. I list them in my book. Number one is wives. Mankind was granted a special privilege that was not afforded to the sons of God, a female counterpart, a wife. The Watchers envied men for their wives, number one. Number two, offspring. Because men have female counterparts, they could procreate offspring. The Watchers wanted to beget their own children and have families, like the sons of Adam. Number three, dominion. Mankind was given dominion of planet Earth. The Watchers coveted man's dominion and plotted to usurp it by producing their own human hybrid sons. This is perhaps the most important and overlooked aspect of their transgression, and it is indeed the most important and overlooked transgression of aspect of the Watchers' transgression. The Watchers, I believe, they plotted to usurp Adam's dominion on earth. How were they going to do it? They knew that Adam had dominion. His dominion is being enforced by the armies of the kingdom, like we talked about earlier. So how can they usurp his dominion and basically take over the earth without themselves stealing it from Adam, because they're not allowed to do that? So they have to usurp the throne of Adam. And the only way that they could do that was to produce heirs to the throne that were human enough to appropriate Adam's authority and to receive the birthright of his genome. Human enough to appropriate the authority and the dominion of Adam. And that's precisely what they did. And I think actually it was pretty ingenious what they did, because not only did they create hybrids who were human enough to usurp the dominion of the human race on Earth, but these hybrids also were really big. These were exceedingly large and powerful entities. So not only could they have the right to Adam's throne, not only could they claim the right to Adam's throne, they had the prowess, the ability, the power to take it by force. And that's precisely what they did. And I believe that the Watchers then created a scenario, instituted what I call, again, the empire of the gods, a scenario in which the gods, the Watchers, were on Earth. They did not have the authority of Adam, so they circumvented that problem by producing their own offspring who were legal claimants to the throne, who could occupy human thrones because they were human enough to do it. And they did indeed occupy human thrones, and men willingly worshiped them and bowed down to them, the offspring of the gods. And remember, by the way, I believe that the Watchers struck a bargain with a faction of the human race, with the line of Cain. I believe the Watchers struck a bargain with the sons of Cain. They would give them what they wanted, and in turn, they would get what they wanted. Remember, we are the regents of Earth. People need to get this in their heads. You can't have fallen angels, which is, by the way, the term fallen angels is a contrivance. I really like to use it because it's not a biblical term. I mean, the concept is true enough. Fallen angels can't just come and kick us out and take over. If they could, they would have a long time ago. The Watchers couldn't just come down, set up shop, and just eradicate us all. They did not have the authority to do that, and they knew that they would be in trouble if they tried very, very quickly. Because the armies of the kingdom would show up, who enforce our authority. All right, so they had to strike a bargain with us. We had to abdicate authority. We had to allow them, to grant them to do something. Okay, this is what the Book of Enoch says. The Watchers came down. They landed on Hermon. They came. By the way, remember, where's that gate that I say to Eden, to the Axis Mundi? No coincidence that they show up on Hermon. Okay, they come down into the plains, and I believe they strike a bargain specifically with the sons of Cain, with the offspring of Cain. Okay, they strike a bargain, and the bargain is, we're going to give you guys, we're going to teach you the knowledge that you were striving to learn. This is what the Book of Enoch says. The Watchers taught men the knowledge they were striving to learn. So the Watchers already knew the knowledge that the offspring of Cain were attempting to learn, that they were desirous to learn. All right? The Watchers had that knowledge. We'll teach you. What do we want in return? Give us your daughters. Let us take them as wives. Notice that they didn't just come down and fornicate. They didn't just come down and rape women. They wanted wives. They took wives. So they chose Wives, I want to marry your daughter. Give me your blessing to marry her. I will give you knowledge. You grant me the blessing. You give me the blessing to marry your daughter. Give me the legal precedent, the legal authority to marry your daughter, me a watcher, and I'm going to give you in turn knowledge. It's a bargain. A bargain was struck. Okay? Why? Because we're the regents of the earth. The watchers are coming into our domain. By the way, anybody or anything, aside from the king himself, who comes into our domain is in our jurisdiction. We're the regents. You break the law in our realm, guess who's going to judge you? The regents. This is why Paul says that we will judge angels. Which angels? Specifically the ones that transgressed in our realm. Okay? We're the regents. We have the authority. You come into our realm, you interlope into our realm, you transgress in our realm, we have the authority to judge you. That's why Enoch was appointed as the, what would you call him? He was the intermediary between God and the watchers. It had to be a man. They broke the law in our realm, and therefore it was a son of man, Enoch, who was delivering their sentence. Okay? God used a human intermediary purposely to judge the watchers who committed, even though the watchers are of a higher estate than we are. When they're in our territory, they're under our jurisdiction. So the watchers had to strike a bargain. They're trying to get this done without the kingdom of heaven interfering. They're trying to do it legally, all right? The game has rules. Like I say in my book, the Game of Thrones has rules. It's not chaos. No, God is not a God of chaos. He's a God of order. And there's procedure and there is order. And you can't nilly-willy break the laws. Not the laws of physics and not the laws of God. You can't, all right? And get away with it, okay? So the watchers are here. They're in our jurisdiction. They know that in order to do what they want to do, they have to be sly. They have to be cunning, just like the serpent. They have to be cunning. They have to get us to abdicate our authority, and then they have to usurp the dominion of the earth. They can't just take it. They have to usurp it. They strike a bargain with the offspring of Cain. I believe it was the offspring of Cain, and there's reasons why I say that. Strike a bargain. We're going to teach you the knowledge you want. You give us your wives in marriage. Above board and legal, right? The offspring of Cain were legally authorized to give their wives in marriage. Of course, this is the way that the ancient world worked. You know, it wasn't like Match.com, go out and find a partner and you end up marrying him. No, the fathers who were the authority in their household, they had to give their daughters in marriage, give them in marriage. You had to get the father's blessing. And by the way, that law is still in effect, even though we don't follow it anymore. That doesn't mean it's not in operation, okay? And there's problems that arise when it's not done properly. It's just the way it is. The fathers had to give their daughters in marriage. And, you know, that's where the dowries and things like this come into play. So the watchers, you know, they gave a dowry for the hand of the daughters. They gave knowledge. The men gave their daughters in marriage. Not rape, not just fornication, in marriage. Very important point there. What's it demonstrating? It's demonstrating our authority is what it's demonstrating. Giving their daughters in marriage, and then the watchers gave their knowledge. They taught men to do all these things, right? And they wrought great evil in the earth. It's like giving kids matches and sending them to run through dry fields. The watchers then did something very cunning. They had their wives now. They got these wives, so they get to fulfill the first cause. They get to fulfill their first desire, which is to take wives and to copulate with them because they lusted. They were lusting after these women. They copulated. Now they get to fulfill their second desire, which is to procreate offspring, hybrid offspring. And that is indeed what they did. The women gave birth to hybrid half-breed sons, possibly daughters too, certainly half-breed sons, okay? And these sons, I'm of the persuasion that it was like very much like gigantism. Women give birth to babies with gigantism, normal-sized babies. And those babies, because of the disease of the genetic anomaly of gigantism, their growth accelerates. After they're born, their growth accelerates, and they end up becoming huge. So that same principle could have been in effect. The women could have given birth to normal-sized babies, and then something in their genomes kicked in, accelerated growth, okay? And there's probably half a dozen other ideas. So these hybrids are emerging from the womb, part watcher, part, I'm going to use this term, elder race, and part human race. What ratio? They're probably a little bit more elder race according to the book of Enoch, because it said you were mainly of your fathers, remember? But human enough to inherit the birthright of Adam. There's the key. To legally inherit the birthright of Adam. So watch what the Watchers did. The Watchers legally made an agreement with the regents of the earth, us, for our daughters. We give you knowledge, you give us your women to take as wives. And then they gave birth to legal claimants to the throne of Adam, human enough to occupy that throne. Okay? And that's exactly what they did. And then the Watchers achieved through their sons, through their wives, they achieved their second objective, the procreation of their sons. And through their sons, they achieved the third objective, dominion of the earth. By proxy. And I talk a lot about this idea, rule by proxy. It's very, very important. I won't go into it now, but it's in my book. This concept of rule by proxy. So if I can't legally have dominion on the earth, but I can create a hybrid son who can, then I can, in effect, rule from behind his throne. All right? And now we are setting up a shadow. Now we're beginning to understand maybe what the dragon is going to do with his son. And so they usurped the earth, dominion of the earth. Men, according to the book of Enoch, they were subjugated to the offspring of the Watchers, and they had to feed them, remember? And when they couldn't sustain them anymore, what did the offspring of the Watchers do? Because they were giants, they devoured the men. It was a dystopia in which the offspring of the Watchers were ruling the earth. Men had lost dominion. It was usurped. And that's why the slate had to be cleaned. And there had to be a reset. You know, you got to ask the question, where was the devil in all of this, right? And when I say the devil, of course, the devil is a very generic colloquial term that the best designation is the dragon. You know who this is? It's like the Harry Potter series. It's like Voldemort, he who shall not be named, or however it is. That's how the Bible treats this guy. Because his name isn't Lucifer. That's not his name. And, you know, it's okay for people to call him Lucifer. I guess that's an appropriate designation because it does fit. We're not told his name. His name is not to be spoken. It's like he's so abominable. He's so despicable that his name isn't spoken. That's how this character is treated in the Bible. He's called by many names, and dragon is one, the dragon. But I think there are more than one dragon, by the way. I think there's 7. And I get into that in the book. But this goes back to, you know, what people have called the seed war back in Genesis 3, where the Maker himself pronounces this prophecy. In short, the offspring of the serpent would be in conflict, perpetual conflict with the offspring of the woman, and that, you know, her seed would basically fight with your seed, and you will bruise his heel, but he will crush your head. This is a prophecy that, again, is spoken from the lips of the Maker. So the dragon has a problem right off the bat. He knows he knows there's a dragon slayer. That's what I call it, the dragon slayer prophecy. He knows there's a dragon slayer coming at some point, and that dragon slayer who's going to crush his head is going to be born from the womb of a daughter of Eve. He knows that. And it's inevitable. God spoke it. It's not, you know, will this prophecy come to pass? It's coming to pass. And so he goes about and he spends all of his effort and energy on foiling this prophecy, frustrating this prophecy. The question that always really bothered me was, you have this group of entities called Watchers who descend to the earth and engage in all this chicanery on earth. Where was the devil? Where was the dragon during all of this? Why was he implicated in this crime? And I think he was much more cunning than that. I think he probably maybe set the board for this to happen. Maybe he brought the pieces together, but he kept his hands clean enough not to be implicated in the judgment of the Watchers. He did not commit their transgression yet. I think he will, but he hasn't yet. He did not commit their transgression. If he had, he would have paid their penalty. He didn't. The justice of God is not arbitrary. It's not whimsical. As I said, the law of God is the law of God. It governs the universe. You commit the crime, you pay the price. The judgment fits the crime. If the devil had committed the same trespass as the watchers, he would have been subject to the same condemnation. And he's not yet. So he kept his hands clean, at least clean enough not to be subject to their condemnation, which was to be bound in chains and so forth and put down in Tartarus, which, by the way, isn't that what happens to the dragon at the end of the age? Sounds like he's committing the same crime to me. So this idea, this question of where's the devil in all of this, it's interesting to me because I believe that the dragon was involved in enticing the different elements here that were involved in the transgression of the watchers. But his goal wasn't to produce offspring on earth and do all of this yet. His goal was to eradicate the human species. That was his goal. That was his goal. His prime objective was to get rid of the offspring of Adam. Why? Because if he could eliminate the human species on planet Earth, then he would succeed in foiling the dragon slayer prophecy. There wouldn't be any more daughters of Eve to give birth to a dragon slayer. Because the son of Adam is coming. And there's a son of Adam who's going to be born at some point in time who is going to crush your head. And so you got to stop this from happening. And this is, of course, what he does from start to finish. I mean, we see this machination all the way through the Bible. Lots of people talk about this, and it's true. It's true. This was the dragon's primary objective. I'm going to eradicate the human race off the face of the planet and therefore avoid this fate of mine, again, pronounced from the lips of the maker. So that was his goal. The Watchers had a different goal. The Watchers wanted dominion of the earth. The dragon wants dominion of the earth too, and he's going to get it for a time, just like the Watchers did. That's not until the end of this age. The narrative of Christ. This is the driving narrative of Scripture from beginning to end. This is the real issue here. Christ is coming. Christ is coming. And the dragon is trying to stop him. He obviously fails. Christ is born from the virgin womb of a daughter of Eve. A little digression here. We were talking about C.S. Lewis earlier, right? Do you remember who has the right to rule in Narnia? Only the sons and daughters of Adam. C.S. Lewis was onto this, okay? And there was somebody trying to usurp the throne of the sons and daughters of Adam. And that was the witch, right? Who was not, a son or daughter of Adam. Okay, so there's a little rabbit hole for people if they're fans of the C.S. Lewis. I'm telling you, Tolkien and Lewis were all over this stuff. This is the machination of the dragon and the machination of the Watchers. They're different. They've got different goals here. The Watchers want to procreate half-breed sons who can inherit the birthright of Adam so that they can have dominion of the earth. The dragon, in this point in time, wants to eradicate the human race. Their purposes cross paths. They dovetail. So the dragon doesn't get his hands dirty in their transgression yet. But he's going to. He didn't yet, though. And so their plan fails. A pure stock was preserved. The unblemished line of Adam was preserved in Noah. Days were shortened before the flood. What was probably a germline genetic situation happening, just spreading out for, by way of reproduction, corrupting all flesh on earth. But the flood came soon enough, and God ensured that Noah's line was not corrupted to preserve the human seed of mankind, the genetic seed of mankind. The reason why I'm saying it in these terms is because we know that at the end of the age, the days are going to be shortened for the sake of the elect, I believe, not to save their lives. I mean, we're all going to die, not to save our lives, but to preserve our humanity.
Dying in despair, there's a shadow falling down upon the land. Now the devil's on the loose. He knows the time it's coming soon for the final battle with the Son of Man. Now don't you want to join the winning side? My friend, it's time to come to Christ. Come to Christ. Time to wake up now. Come to Christ. This is your final hour. The night's soon coming when man can't work. The Lord's coming back to judge this earth. Before your clock unwinds, it's time to come to Christ. or die is his command. Now it's time for you to choose, for Armageddon's coming soon. Accept his mark or die for the Son of Man. Now don't you get caught up in Satan's lies, 'cause Christ will come as a thief in the night. Time to wake up now. This is your final hour. The new world order, it just won't work. The Lord's coming back to judge this earth. Before your clock unwinds, it's time to come to Christ. With a two-edged sword, the Lord's riding high on his white horse. The angels and the saints at his command. The bridles will be gliding high on the blood of the lost. For on that fearful day no one can stand. Well, don't you want to stand at his right side? You see, my friend, it's all been prophesied. Time to wake up now. This is the final hour before the Father's clock unwinds. Don't let your time pass you by. My friend, it's always time. Time to come to Christ. Before the false prophet lies, it's time to come to Christ. Don't get caught by surprise. It's time to come to Christ. For your soul you decide. You gotta come to Christ. Why don't you come to Christ?